Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about counters in Japanese. Now, as we all know, the textbooks like to present Japanese of that kind of mysterious language full of completely random and irrational rules and items that we just have to learn because there's no particular reason for them. And as you all know, if you've been following my video lessons, most of the time this isn't true. Most of what goes on in Japanese is completely reasonable and logical if you just know how it works, which the people who write textbooks don't appear to. So, trunkers might seem like an exception to this rule. There are a lot of them, an awful lot of counters. In Japanese, you can't just say 1 dog, or 2 flowers, or 3 birds. You have to use a counter. So we say, if Vicky no inu. 1 dog, and the counter here is chiki, which gets pronounced Vicky in this particular instance. For 3 birds, we say Sama no tori, and a wa is a counter. So it looks as if we have to learn an awful lot of counters, doesn't it? Just to say what in English you can say by the number and the thing. And there really are a lot of counters, dozens and dozens of them, so this looks like a problem, doesn't it? But it's not, in fact, nearly as much of a problem as it appears to be. First of all, although there are an awful lot of counters, only about a dozen of them are really commonly used. Secondly, most of the time we can avoid them by using the native Japanese counting system, which doesn't require counters. So if we use the Hitotsu, Futatsu, Mitsu, Yotsu, Yinsutsu counting system, we don't need any counters. We can use them for nearly everything. Not people, not small animals. But practically everything else, we can use the Japanese counting system if we want to. So the important thing here, as I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear me say, is that what we're not going to do is start learning lists or counters. That, if you'll excuse the expression, would simply be counterproductive. And there are several reasons why we don't need to. First of all, in terms of understanding Japanese, they don't present many problems at all. If we hear someone saying a number and a thing we know, if there's a little word in between the two, we know it's a counter. So we know what they've said. If they say, Ichirin no hana, we know they're saying 1 floor. Ichi, hana, hanari, must be the counter. If we hear someone saying niwa no tori, you know that they're saying 2 birds. Me, tori, then the wa is the counter. If we hear someone saying sanbiki no neko, now even if we knew hiki but we didn't know that at 3 it becomes biki, that's not a problem because we know san, you know neko, and we know that things that come between numbers and their objects are going to be counters. Should we put them into our Anki? Yes, we should. You'll get to know them over time. But we don't have to fret about learning them. And as I've indicated, the counters aren't pronounced the same way all the time. And that's much less of a problem than it appears to be if we understand how it works. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end. But it's not really terribly important. It's actually much more important to understand how they work structurally. There are 2 ways of using counters, and it's the second of those ways that I think often confuses foreigners. The first way, actually, is quite similar to numbers. So when we use hiki for animals, or mae for sheets of paper, shall we say, it's not that dissimilar to saying 5 heads of cattle, or a dozen sheets of paper. In English, not quite the same thing, but it's very similar. The usage that confuses people is when we say things like Nefoga kohiti imasu, and that could be translated as there are 5 times. And that is how we'd say it in English. In Japanese, we're saying something a little different. And to understand the structure, we need to understand that. So first of all, what kind of a word is a counter? What part of speech does it represent? Well, it's not a verb, and it's not an adjective. It's not a particle, and it's not a conjunction. So 9 times out of 10, what is a word if it's not a verb or an adjective? Or a particle? Or a conjunction? What is it? It's a noun. Nearly always it's a noun, and that is true of counters. Counters are nouns. That's why we use no after them. We say, ichiri no, seno, sambuki no, neko, just as we would with any other noun. Maho no tsue, magic wand. Sambuki no neko, 3 cats. That, when we say neko ga sambuki, do you know, there are 3 cats in English. What are we actually saying? Well, the thing to understand here is that counters aren't ordinary nouns. They are what I called in my video about special noun types. They're what I called proxy nouns. That is to say, adverbial nouns. They are nouns that have the special property of being able to modify verbs. And that's what's happening here. When we say, neko ga sanbuki imasu, we're actually saying, yes, 3 small animals, li, exist. Now that's very difficult in English, isn't it? We could make it sound a little bit simpler by saying cats 3 li exist, or cats exist 3-foldly. But in fact, because of the counter system, we're saying cats exist 3 small animal li. We're describing the way they exist. They exist in a 3 small animals way. If there are 4 of them, they'd be existing in a 4 small animals way. And that's why sentences like that have to end in a verb. The verb modified by a counter is often, as in this case, the verb of being, but it doesn't have to be. For example, we might say, Shashin wo samaitatta. I took photographs 3 flat things li. And while that's very different from the way we put it in English, it's useful and important for the structure to understand that that is in fact what's happening in the Japanese. Now, what about the learning the counters and learning the sound changes of the counters, which really tend to worry people? Now, as I've said, we don't need to learn lists of counters. We'll pick up counters as we go along in our Japanese immersion. And we encounter a new counter in our reading or our Japanese subtitled anime. We can put it into our Anki and we'll gradually build up our stock of counters. Counters that are commonly used, not that huge a number. We have mai or flat things like shitsu paper or coins. We have ho for long round things, satsu for books. That might seem strange because why do we have satsu for books? And hon for long round things when hon actually means book. Well, that's because when the word ho first came into being and meant when I had the things of book, at that time books were long round things. They were scrolls. So the book was counted in the way that other long round things were counted. Whereas later on, when books became flat, things with pages, the counter was changed to satsu. So we probably need a dozen or so counters for everyday use, and we'll pick those up reasonably quickly. But what about all the sound changes? Let's take hiki. It is the counter of small animals. We say, ippiki, no neko, 1 cat. Misiti, no neko, 2 cats. Sambiki, no neko, 3 cats. Yoshiti, no neko, 4 cats. Gositi, no neko, 5 cats. Piki, no neko, 6 cats. Nanohiki, no neko, 7 cats. Hapiki, no neko, 8 cats. Chirhiki, no neko, 9 cats. Jurpiki, no neko, 10 cats. And then other counters have other variations. So it starts to seem very, very complicated, but as a matter of fact, there aren't that many variations, and they follow a very simple pattern. First of all, the first corner of a tangent can't take a 10-10, then there aren't going to be any variations at all. That deals with over half the problem straight away. So, if we have to count just like my countercore, flat things like coins or pieces of paper, can you put a 10-10 on my? No, you can't. You can't put a 10-10 on any of the marquee movement mark column, and therefore there can't be any variant on my, ichi my, ni my, sam my, go my, yon my, and so on. Nin, the counter for plows and wheels. Can you put a 10-10 on li? No, you can't. Can't put a 10-10 on any of the dark, you do that, no columns, can you? So we know that rin can't have any exceptions. Ich rin, ni rin, san rin, yon rin, etc. Or how about wa, the counter for words? Can you put a 10-10 on wa? No, you can't. So, again, that has to be completely regular. Ichi wa, ni wa, san wa, yon wa. So now we've disposed of an awful lot of counters, haven't we? All of those are just straightforward and regular. What about the others? Well, which are the kana onto which you can put a 10-10? It's the ta column, the sha column, the ka column, and of course the ha column, which can have a 10-10 to become fa, people before, or a maru to become fa, people before. What do we know about these? Well, first of all, we know that in the first and last numbers of the sequence, all of them work differently from the non-10-tenable tana, and they all work the same as each other. So if we take kai, a counter for floors in a building, you don't say ichikai, we say ikai. Now if we take sai, the counter for years of age, we don't say ichisai, and say issai. If we take hiki, which we've been dealing with before, we don't say ichihiki, we say ipiki. And that works the same. And with 10 at the other end of the basic scale, you don't say junsai, we say jusai, we say junfai, 10th floor, jupiki no neko, 10 cats. Now, the ka and ha letters, we tend to do the same thing with roku and hanshi as well. So we say ro, piki, ha, piki, no, tai, shai, tai. I mean, we know that. We pretty much know all of it. Sometimes a 10-10 goes on to the counter on san as well. So we say san biki, and we say san gai. But this isn't completely regular. Not everybody says san gai. And a lot of the variations aren't completely regular. The ones I've just told you are pretty regular. And the other odd ones don't tend to be very regular. So if you understand that, it sounds a bit complicated. I wouldn't spend too much time trying to learn what I've just said, but bear it in mind, because it'll just make it a little bit easier to pick this up when you see it. Impiki. Vasita. Sambiki, which is a tendency that San has, of course, only with 10-tenable kono. Go hiki, that's always going to be the same. Aro piki, nana hiki, that's always the same with everything. Ha piti, chur hiti, chur piti. Perhaps even at this stage that's starting to make sense. It's conforming to a regular pattern. They're found all over the place. There are a few exceptions, and nearly all the themes that are genuinely exceptional from the pattern I've taught you tend to be optional. Not all Japanese speakers are going to use them all the time anyway. They will say ipiki, they won't say ichi hiki. They will say ropiki, they won't say roku hiki. If you get it wrong and say roku hiki, it's really not the end of the world. Everyone's going to know what you mean. It'll just sound a little bit too one. And you will pick it up over time because this is the sort of thing you hear again and again, and it just becomes natural. And because the patterns are almost regular across the range of 10 kana, you start to know what sounds right, so that without a lot of intensive learning effort, you'll be saying it right 9 times out of 10 after a reasonable amount of exposure. So it's really not something you need to sit down and learn. You can save your bandwidth for things that really matter. So if you have any questions about chantes, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. Or if you have questions about anything or comments about anything in this video, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokenshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons, and my supporters on Patreon and everywhere. Without you, none of this would have come about, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Koreikara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.